There is a band of small holes running around each of the 3 marble columns in the old market at Pozzuoli. It starts about 3 meters above the floor and runs up the shaft from there. The holes are round, close together, and they were not made by people. They were made by a marine clam, Lithophaga, the date mussel, which bores into stone underwater. It cannot reach 3 meters up a Roman column unless that column has been standing in the sea. For that band to exist, the market floor had to sink below the Mediterranean, stay there for decades while the clams worked, and then come back up into the air. The columns never moved. The ground did. It is still doing it. Everyone knows the mountain on the east side of the bay. Vesuvius has a shape, a summit, a silhouette you can point at. The thing on the west side has no shape. Campi Flegrei is a caldera, roughly 12 by 15 kilometers, a wide, shallow basin of 24 craters and vents, many of them underwater in the Bay of Pozzuoli. There is no cone to look at. The town of Pozzuoli sits inside it. So do the western suburbs of Naples. About 500,000 people live in the zone. The Italian Civil Protection Agency marks in red. Another 3 million live in Greater Naples, just outside the eastern rim, inside the range of what a large eruption here could reach. By the number of people living on top of it, this is the most dangerous caldera on Earth. It does not look like anything. The Italians have a word for what the ground does here. Bradyseism. It means slow movement. The land lifts and settles over years and decades, a few centimeters at a time, carrying the town up and down with it. This is what the clams recorded. The market was built at sea level in Roman times. Over the centuries, the floor sank until seawater flooded in and the date mussels colonized the marble up to about 5.8 meters. Then the ground rose again and lifted the columns back into the air, holes and all. Nobody engineered this as a measuring instrument. It just happened to record several meters of vertical ground movement in a material that keeps the mark. The columns are one of the longest continuous records of a restless caldera anywhere, and they were a fish market. The ground here does not always just rise and settle. Through the early 1500s, residents of Pozzuoli watched new land come up out of the sea. This went on, slowly, for years. Then, in 1538, it stopped being slow. Earthquakes were felt as far as Naples from that April. And by the end of September, there were 5 to 10 a day. On the 28th, the sea drew back from the shore by more than 200 paces. A ridge of new ground stood about 4.5 meters above the water, and the fish left on it were dying in the open air. People came down to collect them. Shortly after sunset the next day, a vent opened near the village of Tripergole. Over about a week, it built a cone 123 meters high, out of ash and rock, where flat ground had been. They named it Monte Nuovo, the new mountain. The village of Tripergole, which had baths and an inn, and had been there for centuries, was underneath it, and is still underneath it. The eruption was small as these things go. It is the last time Campi Flegrei erupted. Everyone living inside the caldera now has only ever known it in the state it was in before 1538. The rising ground. The ground has had three major crises in living memory. Each one lifted the town and then stopped. In 1970, fishermen in the harbor noticed the ferry gangway sitting at a new angle in an arch in the small port that boats used to pass under, while the men stood upright in them. The arch had come up. Rione Terra, the old Greco-Roman core of Pozzuoli on its rock above the harbor, was evacuated. About 2,000 people left, and it has stood mostly empty since. The crisis of 1982 to 1984 was worse. The ground rose about 1.5 meters more. More than 16,000 earthquakes were recorded. Around 20,000 to 25,000 people were moved out of the historic center, mostly because the buildings were cracking, not because anyone expected lava. Then, each time, it stopped. The ground held, the swarms faded, and people moved back. That is the pattern everyone here has learned to trust. It rises, it scares you, it stops. Since 2005, it has been rising again, and it has not stopped. By mid-2025, the ground at Rione Terra had risen about 148 centimeters since the current phase began. Nearly 30 of those centimeters came in a single stretch from the start of 2024. The rate is not steady. Over the years, the monitoring networks have measured it moving between about 1 centimeter a month and 3 centimeters a month faster in the recent swarms. The earthquakes have come with it. In May 2024, a magnitude 4.4 shook Pozzuoli, the strongest in the modern record at that point. In 2025, there were 2 more around 4.4 and 4.6. These are not large earthquakes by global standards, but they are directly under a town, only 1 kilometer or 2 down, and the town is built of old masonry that was never meant to flex. People sleep in their cars during the swarms and go back inside when it goes quiet. The state of emergency declared in 2025 changed the paperwork. It did not change the ground. Ground that rises like this can rise for 2 reasons, and from the surface, they look the same. It can be magma moving toward the surface, or it can be hot water and gas from the system below, pressurizing the shallow rock and lifting it without any new magma arriving. In 1538, the movement ended in an eruption. In the 1970s and 1980s, it did not. INGV and the Osservatorio Vesuviano measure the uplift, the earthquakes, the gas coming out of the ground at Solfatara, the chemistry of it, week by week. The recent work leans toward the shallow system, the fluids, rather than a fresh push of magma. That is the more reassuring reading. But the ground has paused before and resumed. The instruments tell you what is happening now and how fast. They do not tell you when it stops, or whether the next centimeter is the same as the last one, or a different thing wearing the same shape. The clams in the marble recorded a caldera that sank and rose over roughly 2,000 years in a stone that outlasted everyone who used the market. The people who live there now have their own record, shorter and sharper. A harbor arch that came up. A ferry ramp at the wrong angle. 30 centimeters in 2 years. A magnitude 4.4 at dinner time. The surface forgets. Between the crises, the town fills back in. The cafes reopen, the fear settles, and the ground becomes ground again. The land keeps the older record. It is 3 meters of it, bored into a column, standing in a fish market, where anyone can walk past it without looking up. The date mussels needed the market to be underwater for decades before they could leave a mark. That mark is now 3 meters above the floor. In the air, dry. Which means the ground carried them up there and everything else with them. The town, the harbor, the 3 million people who live around a volcano that has no summit to point at and no crater to watch. It is not dormant. It breathes slowly under the houses, and the people on top of it have learned to sleep through the shallow breaths. The record in the marble is the deep one. There is another one on screen about Vesuvius, the mountain across the water, that everyone does watch,